Lots of important things have happened recently, but we're not going to look at them right now. We're going to look at the week in bullshit. Money-geddon! And having failed to depress the nation to death with Dermot's economic cycle a few weeks back, Sky News unveiled their new tactic, Recession Day, starring a demoralising on-screen meter showing how deep in the shit we are.
Well, you can see it there at the bottom of your screen, our debt counter getting on for £39 million. Oh dear.
And regular updates from Sky faces stationed around the country to show how wretched everything is. The end result was the most depressing broadcast since that Alan Yentob series about the guitar. The unrelenting misery kicked off with Eamon Holmes conducting the gloomiest interviews ever.
What does it feel like, the struggle?
I hate it. I really do hate it.
Oh, this is fun, isn't it? I'm glad I tuned in.
Why do you hate it? How does it make you feel?
Frustrated and angry.
Oh, God.
Do you feel abandoned? I mean, tell me what that's like to wake up in the morning. You're a dad, you look at your little baby there, you obviously can't provide what you want to provide. What does that feel like?
Oh, already this is like being trapped in a coffin hearing rainwater seeping through the cracks, and it's only 16 minutes past 8 in the morning.
It's hard, really hard.
Next, Dermot Murnaghan was sent to Coventry to sing a song of financial woe.
The anthem to recession was even written by Coventry's most famous band.
This storm is coming like a ghost storm.
Just to make things worse, alongside the economic tragedy, the rest of the surrounding news that day was grim too. Kay Birdie did her best to lighten things up, but it didn't really work. In fact, it ended up being one of the most awkward segues I've ever seen.
A body has been found, we're told, within the last few moments, so we'll get more on that. I'll be telling you more also about why I'm standing in a kitchen.
But turns out she was standing there to do sad interviews about the recession. She also killed time wearing a Sontaran costume, talking to some old people, patronising a small man.
You didn't expect to be on the telly, did you?
No. And dishing out sexual innuendo to a sweep.
I bet you've cleaned one or two posh chimneys in your time, haven't you?
The day dragged on, with one instance of grinding recessionary despair after another.
I don't know. It's just never going to end.
By the end of the day, it was also dispiriting. Even Jeremy Thompson needed a pint to steady his nerves on air.
203 million. That's what the government is racked up in debt today.
Sky actually left the debt counter running for several days until they gave up trying to work out how much it had racked up.
1 billion and loads.
Now, health is one of the most important things you have unless you own a really expensive car. But can you trust what the news has to say about health and science? Well, the Daily Express recently claimed that breathing in can give you a heart attack. But what does a real doctor think? Here's journalist Dr. Ben Goldacre of the Bad Science column with his view on the MMR scandal. It's his view.
How journalists decide on what makes a good science story has got very little to do with what's true or what's actually got any evidence behind it. I think the media's greatest ever science hoax has been the MMR story, something which they almost invented entirely for themselves.
The vaccine for measles, mumps and rubella, which is given to most children over the age of 1, has been linked with autism.
What was interesting about Andrew Wakefield's paper in 1998 is it was a case series report. It's a perfectly valid kind of thing to do, but it's just a collection of 12 anecdotes written up in a single paper. That can't tell you anything about a link between MMR and autism, simply because MMR and autism are both very common. So to find a few kids who've had both MMR and then gone on to develop autism isn't very special. I mean, that's extraordinary behaviour on the part of the media to selectively only cover dubious, worrying evidence whilst totally ignoring all of the reassuring stuff that was fully published. Even when they're trying to produce sensible news coverage, they still insist on doing everything in the most frightening way they can.
In 15 minutes, 200 of you emailed us about the vaccine. It's only a straw poll, but 182 of you expressed concern or confusion.
If you talk to journalists and say, why did you go to town on this evidence that was clearly not supporting the hypothesis that MMR causes autism, all they will ever say to you is, well, there was an expert from a medical school telling us that this was true. Proper scientists with a good publication record of doing sensible work were publishing exactly the same kind of research, but showing negative results, and they were completely ignored. That was because the story had become a political story more than a science story. MMR kicked off properly in 2002 when a little boy called Leo Blair became old enough to have the MMR vaccine.
He still won't confirm that his son Leo has had the triple vaccine.
They said at the time that this was because of privacy concerns that we journalist respects their right to privacy, an argument which is slightly undermined by the fact that Cherry Blair has now since written in her autobiography about the actual fuck which conceived the child. Once the story became about Leo Blair, it was suddenly the domain of generalist journalists, the glamorous, more famous columnists, the people who normally would be telling us about a very funny thing the au pair said on the way to a dinner party, were suddenly giving the nation incredibly complex health advice on matters of immunology and epidemiology. Andrew Wakefield's up in front of the GMC and an entire nation of journalists are queuing up to blame him, one man, as the scapegoat for their crimes. And that just goes to show, really, how little they understand their role in all of this.
For his supporters, Andrew Wakefield is a hero, and despite prompting a major health scare, he seemed unrepentant.
No regrets, thank you.
The journalist's fantasy about MMR causing autism has run for 10 solid years.
As a concerned citizen, there are a million ways to get your voice heard. You can shout out of the window, you can share every thought that zips through your bonds with a million like-minded twits on Twitter, or you can get your own low-budget BBC 4 show and sit monotonously blarping words down the lens over and over again until all the viewers at home switch over to something more entertaining, such as Andy Dick senselessly killing a dog or something. But useful though all these platforms are, chances are no one's going to take your message seriously until you gather like-minded people together and march through a major city in your thousands, waving placards and chanting slogans. Protests are effective, that's why the Iraq War never happened.
Of course, sometimes demonstrations turn unpleasant, which is bad news for public order, but a veritable bonanza for news networks and the press. Recently, as those world leaders gathered in London for that G20 party, the news excitedly prepared us for the biggest display of public dissent in years.
Not just the biggest, but the most varied too.
There was a protest for just about everything: anti-capitalism, anti-carbon trading, anti-war, anti-wasps, you name it.
In fact, there were so many protesters, Newsnight had to provide a guide to who they were.
There were knackered-looking pacifists, the lead singer from the Flaming Lips, the most earnest man in the world, and an anarchist professor.
We are not protesting. We are overthrowing the government.
Yeah, though he seemed a tad less ominous than that when you saw him going down a kiddie slide.
So there you go, a varied bunch, but still the news was worried.
In fact, given the tone of some of the preemptive coverage in the press, you could have been forgiven for thinking everyone was marching in favour of simply smashing everything in the world to bits.
There were also stories about bankers being told to dress down, although not everyone in the city seemed that bothered.
So in no sense will you allow this process to stop you coming to work?
I shall try not to.
Well, where do you work? The 1930s?
GMTV kept its viewers informed with a helpful VT in which benevolent, stereotypical, crusty environmental types stood around in front of a peace flag, patiently responding to questions about potential trouble.
We hope that, you know, a lot of people come together and create a lot of change.
Not very scary, really. Still, at least they didn't try to oomph things up by slapping together a montage of violent-looking protest material backed with I Predict a Riot by the Kaiser Chiefs.
They also interviewed this climate change protester who said,
"With the situation of climate change being as urgent as it is and as important as it is, we do think it is acceptable to sometimes break the law."
Now, I think when she talks about breaking laws there, she's actually referring to the environmental protesters' plan to erect a little temporary tent city in the street. But GMTV's John Stapleton seemed to take it as a violent anarchist mission statement, a point he repeatedly put to Mark Barrett of the G20 Alliance.
Well, you were saying let's have a peaceable protest, but as you saw from that young lady at the end there, that's not likely to be the case. There are people going there intent on causing trouble.
Well, to be fair to that lady at the end, she represents the climate camp, and they're very much a peaceful movement, and they're all about practical solutions.
So she accepts violence may take place?
She didn't say violence. She said that...
Oh, Stapleton's a tit, isn't he?
To get the ideas into the public realm, sometimes we have to do something that's a little bit different.
So I come back to my point, violence may occur.
It's admirable of GMTV to have hired a totally deaf host.
But you know as well as I do that on some websites that there are people advocating, quote, burn a banker, causing mayhem.
Yeah.
You can't justify that. You must accept there is the risk, given the numbers involved and given the sort of language that's been used by some of the people, not you personally, but other people, there is a real risk of this turning into mayhem, lockdown in the city, and, you know, monumental cost to taxpayers.
Still, in case you weren't put off by all the continued references to potential violence, then hooray!
yes, because as well as dire warnings, the papers and the news bulletins were jam-packed with helpful step-by-step advertising campaigns showing precisely where, when and how the massive bloody rucks they were predicting would take place.
Okay, so we start there.
We'll move across the City of London.
And go there.
Congregate at the Bank of England.
And then it kicks off there.